Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Keith Dodds, and on behalf of ThoughtWorks, I'd like to welcome you to our first quarterly technology briefing for 2009. We've been running these for about 4 years now, and we try to pick topics that we think are going to be of interest, that are going to be thought-provoking to our industry, and occasionally even start an argument. Our topic this morning is lean times require lean thinking. And we think, given the global financial situation, there's hardly been any time in the last couple of decades when this message was more relevant or important to our audience. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Please make sure your mobile's on silent. Secondly, you'll notice that in your chairs there's an evaluation form. We do value your feedback. It helps guide our future topics, so please take a moment to fill that out before you leave and just drop it at the table at the front. And if you find today's topic interesting and the presentations compelling, we are offering a deep dive into the subject of lean thinking and how it applies to software development. And there's also a flyer in your chairs about this. On the 16th and 17th of April, we're going to be hosting international speakers Tom and Mary Poppendieck, who've written 3 books on lean as it applies to software development together with ThoughtWorks. So if you're interested in that, please take note, and you can register on our website. Just before I introduce our speakers, I want to just draw your attention to a recent article that's sort of been making the rounds in ThoughtWorks from the February 2009 issue of the Harvard Business Review, written by Gary Hamel. If you don't know him, he's the most frequently published author that's ever been published in HBR. The article's entitled Moonshots for Management, and it came out of a May 2008 conference on the West Coast before the real depths of the financial crisis had hit, that gathered a whole range of innovative CEOs from major companies, some of the leading business thinkers from top business schools from the United States and Europe, and was supported by McKinsey & Company, one of the world's leading strategy companies. What was striking to many of us in ThoughtWorks about the article and the conclusions from the conference was the heavy overlap between the main recommendations for management and the values and principles and practices that we've been using in Lean and Agile for quite a while. One of the principal conclusions of the conference, which Hamel wrote about, was that the era of what he calls Management 1.0 is over. And Management 1.0 is what he calls the industrial paradigm of management that was largely pioneered by people like Henry Ford and Frederick Winslow Taylor, characterized by organizing and motivating large numbers of relatively unskilled or semi-skilled workers to produce, through essentially repetitive tasks, large numbers of goods and services for a mass market. Hamel argues that the imperatives of what he calls Management 2.0 are radically different. And certainly the depth of the global financial crisis underscores the need to take that on board and think about it. I just want to read you 4, and I'll quote these so you don't think I'm making it up, 4 of the top 10 conclusions of the 25 that the conference reached. Number 1, ensure that the work of management serves a higher purpose. Most companies strive to maximize shareholder wealth, a goal that is inadequate in many respects. As an emotional catalyst, wealth maximization lacks the power to fully mobilize human energies. Tomorrow's management must focus on the achievement of socially significant and noble goals. Now, I happen to know, because I pay attention to the registrations for these events, that most of you work for publicly listed companies where your number one obligation, at least in the management charter, is to maximize shareholder value. So let me ask you a question. How many of you or your coworkers come to work energized and motivated and passionate every day with your primary goal to maximize the wealth of your shareholders? That's what I thought. Number 2, eliminate the pathologies of formal hierarchy. Typical problems include overweighting experience at the expense of new thinking, giving followers little or no influence in choosing their leaders, perpetuating disparities in power that can't be justified by differences in competence, increasing incentives for managers to hoard authority when it should be distributed. That sound familiar? Number 3, reduce fear and increase trust. Command and control systems reflect a deep distrust of employees' commitment and competence. Organizational adaptability, innovation, and employee engagement can only thrive in a high-trust, low-fear culture. And number 4, redefine the work of leadership. In this new model, Management 2.0, the leader's job is to create an environment where every employee has the chance to collaborate, innovate, and excel. So the good news for this morning is that you don't have to wait for your CEO to get on the road to Damascus and embrace those values. What our speakers are going to describe this morning are mindsets, practices, and techniques that your teams can start using today, tomorrow, and next week to improve morale, to increase productivity, and to get everybody that you work with involved in solving the problems that you confront every day. Our speakers this morning are Jason Yip from ThoughtWorks and Paul Heaton from KM&T. Jason is a technical leader at ThoughtWorks and has long had an interest in the human-centered process improvements that can deliver superior software solutions. Jason is a prolific writer and blogger. He speaks at a variety of international conferences, and he recently reminded me that he was a speaker at the first ever XP Agile conference in Sardinia, Italy in 2000. Paul Heaton is the Northern Regional Manager of KM&T, which stands for Knowledge Management and Transfer. KM&T is a global management consulting company that focuses on lean thinking and transformations. Its core employees came out of Toyota, and you'll be hearing more about the Toyota production system this morning, and they apply the lessons of both and the benefits of lean thinking and practices to a wide range of industries. We will have time for question and answer at the end, so please stay with us, and please join me in welcoming Jason and Paul.
Thank you, Keith. Okay, I'm going to just jump right into it. So if we look at where Toyota started out, we're just going to put this out there just to see if we see any similarities to where we are today. This is around 1950, steep recession in Japan, a company out of cash, president actually driven out of the company because they had to lay off about 1,600 people. And the response was this thing called the Toyota production system. It was a response to their particular crisis. Kind of put this up there because when you read about this, when you learn about this, it seems very similar to the situation we're in right now, globally this time. This system didn't come out of good times. So when the dot-com bubble was still big and various other bubbles, there's a tendency for people to say, well, my system's so great because I'm making so much money. But we know in hindsight that it was just pure luck. They didn't have any real problems to deal with. The advantage of looking at this system now called lean is that we know that it came from hardship and survival, right? It was a company that was running out of cash, still needed to provide quality because they couldn't sell cars otherwise, and very little time. So not just that this system works in the longest term, but also it was required for short-term survival. Okay, and how do we know this works? Like what's the advantage of looking at this beyond that, just from where they come from? We know that Toyota has now become a leader, along with their competitor Honda, which grew up with them in Japan. They lead in J.D. Power quality ratings. This is the North American system for comparing vehicle quality in the U.S. They're at the top. This comes from a history when they started out. There's a joke in Japan: if you buy a Toyota truck, you should buy 5 because 4 need to be in the shop. Right, and they got to this. Now that is a joke that you wouldn't even understand today. It's sort of beyond what we think. And also in 2008, Toyota surpassed GM as the world's largest automaker. We know, in contrast, that General Motors, which used to be one of the most powerful corporations in the world, there was a saying that what's good for GM is good for the country. They were talking to U.S. Congress at that time. Like they were beyond reproach. They're huge. Now they're talking about being unable to survive, right? So if we think about this and the situation we're in right now, we don't want to be those companies that are having this kind of discussion. We know that even Toyota and pretty much all the automakers, they're all losing money. But there's no doubt that Toyota will survive, that they'll be at the top of the pack. So what we want to talk about is what does it take to be part of the pack that survives as opposed to the ones that get weeded out. Okay, is this really relevant to us? So I'm going to pass this over to Paul to talk about the scope of the Toyota production system.
So in asking the question, is this relevant to us, we talk about Toyota. And lean has been very, very useful for Toyota over many, many years, but perhaps therein lies a bit of a problem for the rest of us. I think there's a misperception out there that lean can only be used in a very repetitive manufacturing process. But really that's not the case. If we look at this screen here, Toyota is not that dissimilar to lots of our organizations. It's got something in the core, and Toyota really just has manufacturing, making cars at the core, but it doesn't really matter whether you're making burgers or whether you're making software solutions. There's something at the core of the business that is making money. But it's being supported by lots of different departments. You can see here sales and marketing, human resources, procurement, and I think the makeup of Toyota is therefore not that dissimilar to the rest of our organizations. The other thing is that Toyota don't just use lean in their manufacturing process. I know that perhaps some people have heard of it as being the Toyota production system. And yes, it was born out of the production side of Toyota, but it's now used in the rest of the business. So, for example, they're using lean in sales and marketing, but also sort of building plants. We might not all build plants, but we certainly all, hopefully, start new offices. And the scale's slightly different, but the perception and the process is probably quite similar. New product introduction, though, is one that we want to talk about a little bit more in detail. Lean has been used very successfully now within new product introduction within Toyota for a number of years. And some of the metrics, I think, sort of stand for themselves. So you've got a situation where the Prius, I think most people understand the Prius, the hybrid vehicle, it's quite a famous vehicle nowadays. It's been on the market now for a few years, but it only took Toyota 18 months to develop the Prius. So from clay model, which is sort of the beginnings of the process, all the way through to delivery of that vehicle to the marketplace, it only took 18 months. Which I guess, people outside of the automotive world might think is quite a long time. But if you're comparing it with some of their competitors, General Motors was mentioned, Ford are probably of a similar sort of situation. They're taking sort of 4 and 5 years. So you can see that Toyota are getting their products to marketplace a lot quicker than their competitors. So from a productivity point of view, that's pretty good. If you're also looking at the processes that Toyota are using in comparison with the rest of their competitors, they also seem to be much better than the Fords, General Motors, even the Nissans of this world nowadays. You've got a situation where data suggests that only 150 engineers were used within the development of Prius, which is also quite a lot of people, probably more people than there is in this room. But if you compare it to Ford and General Motors, who are using 600, 700 people, sort of 4 times the amount of people to develop a vehicle, a fairly similar vehicle, and you can see that the levels of productivity within Ford are less than those within Toyota. And it's not all about the people. We can't say that the people in Toyota are working harder than the people in any other organization. It's about the process. They're using different processes that are engaging more and more people in solving the problems that much quicker. And therefore, you see from the metrics that you've got a Toyota that's capable of getting a product to marketplace a lot quicker, and probably with equal or even better quality. I think the other thing to mention as well, just out of interest, is that that's just not about producing the vehicle. Toyota have also got to produce the systems that go around producing the vehicle, so they've got to produce, they've got to do a lot of work within the supply base. They've got to also build plants. You've got to either build a brand new plant, or they've got to adapt an existing plant to be able to produce that new vehicle. And that is all being done within 18 months, so it's quite a short amount of time. So I think the message here at the beginning of this presentation is that it's not all about Toyota. It's been born out of Toyota, and they've done a great job of sort of introducing it to the rest of the world. But it's not all about Toyota. It's also used in a variety of different industries. I think Keith alluded to some of the work that we do. And we work in lots of different sectors very successfully using lean techniques. Aerospace, food and beverage, marine, all of which have got sort of a manufacturing tinge to them. So you could say, well, that's still sort of manufacturing. And, you'd be right, although that lots of manufacturing facilities are quite different to Toyota. But still, lean within those organizations is being used very, very successfully. But I think, and that sort of happened over maybe the last sort of 10, 15 years, but certainly over the last sort of 5 or 6, lean's being very, very successfully introduced to the service side of all of our businesses. So it's very useful now within telecommunications. It's been used heavily in banking and insurance. And KM&T work quite heavily in the healthcare system. So it's the healthcare system is something that's as far removed from the manufacturing and repetitive, competitive manufacturing as Toyota as you can get. You're dealing with patients, not dealing with nuts and bolts and vehicles and tires. You're dealing with patients, and it's quite a significant change. It's quite a significant process dealing with different people and different systems, different processes and different problems. But it's still being very successfully used within the healthcare system. In fact, about 35% of our business is in healthcare. Over to you.
I just want to talk a little bit about kind of agile lean. How does it fit together? Paul talked a bit about the industries that lean has gone into, and excuse me, software development is one of the latest entrants. If we go back in time, which is around 96 or late 90s, that sort of time period, and we have this method called Scrum, which is quite popular right now. The origins of that is actually from a paper by some authors that were writing about how product development is done in Japan, specifically Honda, with not a really clear understanding that that's actually inspired by all this Toyota product development. So Scrum picks up these kind of concepts and then turns it into their particular approach. Then from there, based on other factors, we created this thing called Agile. Now, in recent times, started by the Popendix, this workshop we have coming up, that movement, that source is coming back in. So now we're talking about very explicitly lean software development. So where do we pull from the origin, what other things are worth looking at, as well as really almost direct application now. So there is a lot of people talking about Kanban systems, which is a pull system-based software development approach. Now it takes a much stronger lean feel. So lean is not just manufacturing. It's not just the other traditional things it's got into, but now also this idea of lean software development. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about what lean is. So we kind of threw this term out there, but let's talk about some of the basics. Some things you may have heard of before. Just-in-time. Actually, just a show of hands. How many people have heard of just-in-time? Ooh, that's good. That's better than Brisbane, isn't it? Yeah, it is a lot better than Brisbane. That's interesting. I don't know why. Okay, this is very simple. Right material, right time, right place, right amount. So this originated from some Toyota guys. I'm not quite sure about the history exactly, but someone visited a supermarket in the U.S. called Piggly Wiggly and noticed that, yeah, it's a weird name. It's a Southern American chain. It still exists. You can find it. But they noticed that the way that they restocked the shelf was waiting until someone took an item off, and then they put that item back. So, and then from that inspired pull systems. So we don't work on something until we need it, and then we wait until that point. The contrast to this is something called just in case, which means, we build a lot of stuff just in case we need it. Now, a lot of times we don't need it, in which case we waste various things. And we'll talk a little bit more about what those wastes are. How about stop the line? How many people have heard of this? Not so much. Oh, interesting. So that's an interesting point. There are a few people that talk about this is more important than just in time. If you don't have this culture in place, the other one falls apart. So stop the line is, in essence, within a factory, it is like if you go in a Toyota plant, they have this cord you pull. If the part's coming by and there's something wrong with it, you pull the cord, the line stops, and you fix it immediately. Now, that general concept can be applied in multiple situations. Simply the attitude, the mindset, the culture of stop to fix things now, don't wait for them to become bigger later. Within a factory setting, that's what happens. Like Keith always gives this story about his time at Ford, where you look at the end of the line and they're just spending all this time trying to fix the car that doesn't work at the end. That's very expensive. Even within a software development industry, we know the same thing. Just stacking stuff, waiting till the end to fix things is tremendously more expensive. So that's stop the line. Now, what we're going to argue today is that those two things are very powerful solutions, very useful, but that's not the essence of the system. It's not the essence of the approach. The essence of the approach is engaging everyone to solve problems.
So we've now got to the stage where we know that we need to engage as many people in trying to solve our problems as we can. And we just look at this picture here, which is courtesy of Toyota. I'll put a little bit of context, I think, behind this particular slide, because it always makes it a little bit easier to explain. Yesterday I was at a wine producing company, so a good company, but I wasn't in their manufacturing facility. I was in their customer services facility, which was taking in a lot of orders from the likes of Coles and Woolworths and quite a few wholesalers. And there were about 6 people working in that department. And they were constantly getting a lot of credit, so they were sending products out to their customers, and customers were sending them back saying, I just don't want it. That's not what I ordered. What are you doing? Very difficult situation for the company to be in. On investigation, it was, as a result, to some degree, not entirely, but to some degree, about this one on the top right here, unevenness. So Lean says you've got to sort of have a balanced workflow. This particular company had about, I think it was about 40% of its entire week's workload was in the first 5 hours of the first day of the week. So, you've got a situation where you've got the same amount of resource working throughout all of the work, the 5 days of the week, but it was actually engaged in 40% of its work in the first sort of 3 or 4 hours, maybe 4 or 5 hours of its working week, which is a crazy situation. So there was a definite imbalance in the amount of activity that particular part of their organization was having to deal with. That led to one of the key aspects of Lean, and that's overburden. And I think we're all familiar with overburden. I'm sure we all, I know I do, and I'm sure you do, get to stages where you just got too much on your shoulders and you're walking around and, you're really sort of upset and demoralized, perhaps thinking about leaving, perhaps taking sickness, perhaps rushing to make mistakes. Rushing and making mistakes. And that's a classic example of when we're overburdened. And we've got to get into a situation where we're not overburdening the people that are working for us and the systems and the processes that we've got working for us as well. It's waste that we're going to spend a little bit more time talking about, though, because waste is a product, to some degree, of imbalance and overburden. Get back to the example of rushing, get back to the example of not doing as good a job as we possibly can do, and therefore letting the customer down. So we'll talk a little bit more about waste. What is waste? It's the stuff that we sort of typically throw in the trash can or the rubbish bin, and that's just about it. But waste, from a Lean point of view, is categorized. The theory is that if we categorize it, we can see it. If we can see it, we can deal with it a little bit easier. We can perhaps reduce it. We can perhaps even remove the different wastes that we're seeing within our organization, within our processes. And there are 8 different types of waste that Lean specifies. We'll talk about each one of these in a little bit more depth in a moment. But this was born out of the Toyota production system. It was born out of making vehicles. But since then, over the last sort of 15, 20 years, we've found that these 8 wastes are quite generic in nature. You can go into any sector, look at any process in any business, and you will find these 8 wastes. Some organizations might have more of one waste than of another, but typically you would find an example of each one of these 8 wastes. So we'll go through each one very quickly. I've used healthcare as an example, one, because Jason's talking about IT-specific stuff, and I think healthcare sort of resonates with most of us. We've all got some level of interaction with healthcare, and we've got perhaps a perception of whether it's good, bad, or a bit indifferent. If we go through 8 of the waste, the top one is waiting. These aren't in any particular order of priority, but waiting always comes to the top of the mind, I guess, for most people, because we're just fed up of waiting. We're waiting for someone to finish their work before we can start ours. From a manufacturing point of view, we're waiting for raw materials to come to the line so that we can start producing whatever we need to produce. And waiting is a key issue with regard to understanding waste within our organization. Certainly waiting from a healthcare point of view, just waiting for nurses, waiting for doctors who are busy doing other things, admittedly, but waiting for some service. Overproduction. Well, going back to automotive, one of the cardinal sins, you will find that Toyota as an organization will only produce to demand. It will only produce on a just-in-time basis. You will, maybe slightly now, but under normal circumstances, you would not find fields of cars that are Toyota cars, whereas you see quite a few fields of cars, produced by General Motors and Ford and so on and so forth. They do it to sort of improve, in the short term, the productivity of their plants. But in the long term, it's a waste to the business. I've had an example of the top one there, which is, I was asked to go into hospital. I was asked to do some prep before I went in. They sent me a letter saying, do this. These are the drugs that you should take. So I took them. But actually, I was sent 2 letters. I was sent the same letter twice with the same lots of drugs twice. It's just a waste within the system. Just a very minor example. but something that's happening quite a lot. Transport or conveyance, quite a difficult one, this. We all have to make products, and typically if we're making a product, we all have to ship it. So we're making something here, we have to ship it to our customer, and that length of transport we need to understand and measure so that we can try and reduce it. Can we eliminate it? Perhaps not sometimes, but we can try and reduce it. For example, I come from a manufacturing background, and I used to run a JIT plant, a seating plant for Ford, and seats are very difficult products to make. They've got explosive airbags, quite aesthetic in value and all that sort of good stuff. And transporting them is a risk to damage, and therefore I needed to try and get into a situation where I was transporting my products less. And the solution was just to build the plant next to the supplier, next to the customer. Quite an unusual situation, but we produced our seats here, the customer was here, and our products were only transported just on a very small conveyor rather than it being in the back of a lorry for sort of 10, 15, 20 kilometers. So transport is something that you might not ordinarily be able to completely remove, but you could perhaps reduce it. Over-processing, engineering terms, sort of over-engineering, doing something that the client's just not going to pay for. Interesting here, the second one here is that typically our experience is that junior doctors tend to ask for patients to be tested more regularly. They ask for more patients to be tested because perhaps a level of insecurity in comparison with a more senior doctor who might, for example, ask for less tests. Therefore, a level of waste perhaps is evident there. Rework, I think we're all familiar with rework, just correcting something that really should have been done right in the first place. Stock, other word, inventory, accountants would call it cash tied up in the business that could be better used elsewhere. Too many drugs in a ward, an example of something in the healthcare service where you've got too much stock, too much inventory, too much cash tied up that could be better used. Motion, look, it's slightly different here from sector to sector. From a manufacturing point of view, if I'm an assembly person here and I'm being asked to produce this thing, whatever it is, this clicker, motion would be, or a waste of motion would be going to the raw materials and going over here and then going over here and then perhaps going to that machine over there, just walking around, not really adding value. So that would be a waste within manufacturing. In an office environment, it might be, for example, the layout of the office is not conducive to adding a great amount of value. Perhaps, for example, I've got my desk here, and I'm forever having to use the printer, but the printer is over in the corner of the room. Consistently walking up and down, and just wasting my time and not really adding value. So motion is something that we need to understand to try and reduce and perhaps eliminate. Resource is the last, very quickly, but it is a very important one, is that we've talked about empowering people and getting people involved in the process and getting involved in solving the problems that all of our businesses have got. And waste, one of the critical wastes is just not using people. Forever we are going into organizations where, even in the sophisticated world that we live in, people are just coming in, not being asked to contribute to solving of problems, and getting involved in that entire process. And that's a bit of a shame. But it's something that we need to be aware of so that we can understand that we've got to get as many people involved in solving our problems as we possibly can. So resource is a significant resource waste if we're not using those people effectively. Certainly, how many times do we not listen? I'm not perfect. There's sometimes when I don't listen. How many times are we not asking questions about, what's wrong? Can I help you? Can we solve that problem together? It's a regular occurrence in lots of our different industries. So how does this fit with IT? And I'm going to pass over to Jason now.
Okay, a lot of what Paul talks about, we could probably see some parallels to our type of work in this so-called knowledge-based work. But I'd like to talk a little bit more about certain aspects of IT because I think we work with different types of things which cause different forces involved, which means we think about things a bit differently. I have three categories here based on what I've seen and what we've seen at ThoughtWorks about the types of work we involve ourselves in. One is this thing called business as usual, the change request, small defect fixes, keeping production up, that sort of thing. That tends to be a little bit more repetitive, more like what manufacturing deals with. We understand our problem area very well. We normally understand the solution area right now very well because we don't typically manipulate the technology a lot in an operating system. So we can specify input very clearly. We can focus on task efficiency, so how fast are we executing these relatively controlled tasks, and we focus on things like cycle time and cost reduction. So it's a significant part of what IT is about, actually. So, but we usually talk a lot about projects. So and I'll call this the typical project, because projects also vary in terms of their degrees of understanding. Let's say for a typical project, though, the understanding of the problem space is not quite as strong as a BAU activity, and we do these things called iterations, iterative development. Because we know that we are learning about our problem as we go along. It's not completely unknown, and we normally want to control the risk, which is why we have in solution space, we want to control what needs to be learned. We don't want to take on too many things, and we're talking about ROI. This is an important point, because in manufacturing they talk about rework being a waste. When we're doing something where we're learning, it changes the way we see that. Iteration in this case is not really waste, in the sense that we require this experimentation in order to learn. Now that becomes even more explicit when we're doing something that I'll call new product development. This is when we're attempting a problem that we've never done before, using technologies that we've never used before. We can't treat those activities the same way we treat the other ones, because now we're not specifying the input because we don't know how to do it yet. The specification is really the output of this activity. And our focus is no longer on task efficiency, but more on learning efficiency. How fast can we learn about these spaces, problem and solution, and how can we funnel that down so that we can shift to a different mode? The focus there is more about acquiring and exploiting knowledge faster than competitors. So if we think about what Paul was talking about, the Prius, that's an example of this type of thinking. Okay. So now we'll move on to waste from the perspective of software development. Just to understand that, we'll step back a bit and think about what does waste mean fundamentally. So the 8 wastes that Paul listed there are the ones that we've observed over time, are the patterns that show up in manufacturing, repetitive process, and other industries as well. But the essence is that if you put yourself in the position of a customer and say, if this producer did not do that step, would I pay any less for the product? If my answer is no, then that step is open to removal or reduction. Right? And that's how we can think about it. So within software, very similar to the manufacturing waste, except with any kind of knowledge-based work, other things tend to rise in importance. First one is pretty much the same as manufacturing. Overproduction is an issue for us with typical project work. This is from an XP 2002 report. This is from the Standish Group. About 64% of features are rarely or never used. Sorry. Okay. Right. So if we think about it, most projects, a significant portion is not needed. That's the same thing as overproduction in a manufacturing context. Producing more cars than you need. We produce more features than we need. Okay. Delays, the same thing. It's waiting for, like, we still wait for people to do stuff. I've seen Dan down there. We've gone through the sign-off thing before, and there's a lot of waiting involved. But everyone's experienced that. We have a lot of delays. It's not really any different. Handoffs is somewhat related to that. It's the idea that instead of directly communicating with someone, we have to go through multiple channels. So I talk to my manager, that manager talks to another manager, and then maybe back down to an actual person doing the work, and then back up and back and forth. So we know that that's going to introduce delays. We know it's going to introduce misunderstanding and therefore defects. So that's handoff. With knowledge-based work, that's a very significant source of waste, or a waste in itself, rather than in physical manufacturing, it's slightly different. Okay, I'm going to skip ahead of relearning. Is just mentioning that because if we're thinking about learning efficiency rather than task efficiency, having to learn again means that we're doubling our efforts. Partially done work is very similar to, like, it's our version of inventory. It's the idea that even though it doesn't cost us anything to store partial work, in the same sense that if I have a part of a car and I have to build a warehouse to store this material. We don't have that problem. It's sort of a shared drive or something. It's not that expensive. Independent of internal accounting, disk space is actually quite cheap. But we know we have the same issue where we are utilizing cash and resources to do something before we need it, which could have been better spent on other things that we needed at that moment rather than later. So that's how you kind of think about inventory in a knowledge-based sense, which means that partially done work is our version of inventory. Okay, I just throw out task switching is quite an important one because this is one when I go to different organizations and we talk about what kind of problems you have. Most people don't even remember to mention that they have a task switching problem until you look a little bit closer. This is just it's very similar to when we talk about overburdening. So how many, like it would be like, how many projects are you on? And people say, oh, I'm on 4 or 5 or something. And you go, how often are these projects actually completing, right? The idea is that if we put a lot of work on people so they look very busy, there's a lot of effort involved, that somehow that's going to produce more work out the end. And we know, if just very simple model here, that when you do that, all it means is that everything is late. Nothing can finish early when we multitask, and we know that. But it still happens a lot. So this is a significant waste in our industry. The final two things are pretty much the same as what Paul's mentioning. Defects, things that are not about learning. So if we're investigating something we don't know about, that's not a defect when it turns out that it was wrong. That's just learning. But when we know something or we should have known something and we do it wrong anyway, that's a defect. It's unnecessary rework. And unused employee creativity is again, the essence of it. Most of the time, someone knows that these issues are there, and then we don't exploit that. We don't bother to find out.
Okay, so we now get to a situation where we know that there are different types of waste, and we're trying to engage as many people in the identification of those wastes and the solving of those problems. This is just a very quick slide. It's another sort of enhanced visualization of waste. You've got the green stuff here, which is not waste at all. It's the added value stuff. It's the stuff that we're being paid to do, the stuff that we need to try and maximize. I think we all know that. The orange is what we call sort of a necessary waste, which might seem a bit of a contradiction in terms, but necessary waste is the stuff that we can't always completely remove, and the transportation example of having a JIT plant next to its customer is an example of that, or an office that's very closely aligned to its major customer. Again, it will be a typical example of trying to reduce transportation, but perhaps not completely removing it. So it's something that we need to try and reduce, perhaps not completely eliminate. Red is the real terrible stuff that we've got to get rid of quickly. Rework, as an example, would be a good example. So, you know, what does all this mean? You know, what relevance is all of this? Well, the example here, again, is just sticking with the healthcare theme. So we were asked to go into a hospital in Australia, but it could have been any hospital in the entire world, I'm sure, and we were looking at a renal patient. So a renal patient with issues was coming into a hospital, going through a process, and then going back home after having some treatment. We were looking at it from the end-to-end value, so you know, the full patient's flow from leaving home to going back home, and we were looking at it from the customer's point of view. In this particular case, that was the patient. So very sort of simplistic pictorial view of what this particular patient was going through, and they were coming into hospital, and then they were waiting to be seen, and we now know that waiting is a waste, and so on and so forth. They might get a bed, and they might then be waiting to see somebody else, which is waiting. We might then get a patient being transferred from one ward to another. For some reason, it might be regarded as being waste. So they're going through that process, and that's the way that we were trying to visualize the process that that particular patient was going through. So what did we do? Well, a couple of tools that we used to try and understand what wastes we were encountering is first one, is process mapping. So that one there is just a very minor one. That was the full process, and you can see that it's a process where we get people together in a team environment, and we get them in the same room, talking about the same problem, talking about this particular patient, and mapping that patient's route through the process. And it's perhaps a familiar tool to you guys. But you can see it's a great process, it's visual, and it gets people talking about the same problem and understanding what that particular patient's going through. This patient went through, we regard as being 36 primary steps. So he was going into hospital, going through 36 steps, and then going out of hospital. So considering the wastes that we've already gone through, sort of hands up now, how many people believe that that patient or those patients were going through that process and 75% plus was actually adding value to that renal patient? Hands up, anybody? No optimists? No? 50 to 75%. Anybody? No. It's amazing. 25 to 50%. Okay. Maybe a quarter. So the remainder, 25% less. Oh, yeah. All pessimists, eh? Look, I mean, actually, 7 out of 36 were regarded as being adding value to that particular client. The rest were waste that we either had to try and reduce or eliminate. So, you know, less than 20% is obviously quite an issue. But that's sort of fairly typical. You know, we don't want to sort of say that, you know, this hospital was doing a really bad job. It wasn't. Actually, 20%-ish of added value and 80%-ish of non-added value is fairly typical, whatever sector you go into, whatever process you're looking at. So, you know, this hospital was doing sort of a normal job. Do we accept 77 out of 36? Well, no, we need to try and improve that, particularly when you're looking at the patient experience. We've just got a couple of examples here, apart from the process mapping example that we touched on earlier, of techniques that we were able to use that I think are easily transferable across all sectors when they're solving problems. The first one is what we call problem and countermeasure, and it's a sheet that's, and it's a tool that's just a straight take from Toyota. It's something that we use in all of our clients, whatever really the problem that we're trying to solve. So what is it? Well, it's a very simple, basic visual system which allows people to be engaged in the process of capturing problems. So we don't have it tied up on a computer screen. We print it out on a big piece of paper, so they're that big. And we put it up on the wall, so if we're in a ward, it will be in the ward, or a theatre. If we're in a manufacturing facility, then it will be on the factory floor. In an office, it will obviously be in the office. And we encourage people that are a part of the team to record the problems that they're encountering on a day-to-day basis, you know, the frustrations that really, you know, we're getting a little bit upset about. And I think we're all sort of quite similar of a makeup. You know, we often get into situations where, you know, we hit a problem, we try and sort of skirt around it, and you know, we don't want to really deal with the root cause. We just try and skirt around it. We're probably fairly successful at skirting around it just to sort of expedite the job that we're getting to do. And, you know, quite successfully, but that doesn't really get to the root cause of the problem. So we ask and encourage people to record problems here on sort of this sort of side. There's a little bit of training involved. You've got to sort of say, you know, this is a problem, this is the impact on the problem, but you know, it's not very much training. But at least they're capturing the problems that they're dealing with on a day-to-day basis. At the point of capturing, then you've got to deal with it, and the team environment that this encourages is a good way of dealing with those problems. So typically, and the picture I think sort of demonstrates it, that typically on a day-to-day basis, the team would come together, they would go up to that wall if the sheet was on that wall, and they would gather around it, and they would talk about the problems that people were encountering through their daily tasking. And, you know, it's amazing when people get together and start talking about the same problem, that you find that, you know, this internal supplier here really didn't know that this internal customer here was being given a problem by this person. They just didn't know it. And you know, often problems can be solved very, very quickly when people are just getting together, talking about the same problem in the same environment in a bit of peace and quiet. So it's good for that thing. It's good for recording problems and getting people together to talk about those problems. Not every problem can be solved that way. You know, that's probably you know, the world's just not that simple, unfortunately, and there are some problems that really need sort of a high level of problem solving, and Lean has tools to do that as well, but we can't really get into that now. The other aspect of this is that it starts tracking problems. You know, people have got certain responsibilities to go away and start dealing with the problem solution, and it's a way of sort of tracking that. So it's a good visual tool for understanding what the problems are, assigning responsibility, and getting on with the solving of those problems. So we find it a very, very useful product indeed, and it gets everybody involved, going back to that sort of people engagement. So that's one tool. This is really, I guess, more of a principle than anything. It's Dr. Deming's Plan, Do, Check, Act. It's something that Toyota have been using for many years. Some people is anybody familiar with it? Hands up. Plan, Do, Check, Act. Yeah. A few people. Look, very quickly, it's a way of sort of continuously accelerating the learning that you've got within your organization. So lots of organizations are pretty good at planning. You know, they've got a problem, they'll plan to solve it. They'll probably execute that plan, or the do bit of it, pretty well as well. But sometimes, you know, organizations stop at that point and they go on to the next problem. They don't go and actually check that the problems that they're trying to solve, the systems that they've injected have actually solved the problem. And even if they do that, sometimes they don't go and act, or I like to use the word adjust the process that they're introducing that should have solved that problem. It's a perpetual process of continuous improvement. I think the other thing to consider is that if you've got a timeline of activity, so let's say here you've got a customer who wants A, B, and C, and you understand what that customer wants, and you're going through sort of research and development, sort of building, testing, and so on and so forth, and you get to this sort of stage here, it's good to do plan, do, check, act here, but, it's too late. Problems that are raised here are quite difficult and time-consuming and expensive to solve. It's best to do it throughout the whole timeline. So you're doing plan, do, check, act through the whole process on a regular basis, accelerating those learnings. It's a really important tool within Lean. There are lots of other tools that we used, but in terms of the output of this particular activity, the patient was actually originally going through that process. The renal patient that we were talking about earlier was going through that process in 15 days, which is quite a long time to be in hospital for anybody. We did some good stuff that we've already talked about, the process mapping, waste identification, waste elimination or minimization, and we got to a pretty good score. We've got 8 days here. Actually, when we stopped our contract with them, we'd actually got to 10 days, so we'd gone from 15 to 10 days, which we thought was a pretty good achievement. And obviously getting a patient back home 5 days earlier is great. It also means that we're freeing up beds that much earlier, so people are going through that process a lot quicker. The good thing about this story is that this is not all about project to project. This is about instilling discipline, instilling processes that are just a part of your natural everyday business. And this team got this, and they understood that they had to carry on using it, even if we were not there. And they did this, and they were able to sort of continue to look at the waste, eke out every hour. And thankfully, this team continued with that process. And the great story from their point of view, and they did a really good job, is that they took that patient from a 15-day process to an 8-day process. So you can see that through that kind of quite simplified process, you get to a situation where you're reducing all of that waste and you're getting a patient through that process a lot quicker, which is a really good achievement using pretty simple tools over a relatively short amount of time.
When it comes to software development or IT as opposed to manufacturing, we have the issue where it's actually much more difficult for us to see what's happening. When you do value stream mapping exercise, typically you can walk the path, walk the process, and you can see things. You can just watch them happening. With us, it's more difficult. You can't see it. If I go to a typical office, people just seem to be sitting around staring at things and nothing's happening. But we know that there is work happening, and it's a very similar process. So the workshop that Paul was showing with everyone there, and we have things on walls, is pretty much the same. So that activity looks very similar. I put up an example of this is a value stream map of a typical waterfall life cycle. We split up each activity here into value-added time, so things that we know is valuable for our customer, elapsed time, which is the actual overall time for that step. If you can think about it, we might do an activity, but not all of, 100% of the activity is not value-added. It's usually portions of it are not useful. And then you have a cumulative elapsed time, so how much time overall is it taking? So this is a way to utilize value stream mapping in a knowledge-based situation. With the waterfall life cycle, there are very typical waste there, movement, weighting, excess inventory in the sense of having a lot of partially completed work, defects, extra features, weighting, all the same stuff. I'm just doing this as a generic thing, but if you actually look at your specific waterfall-like processes, you'll find very similar results. And being ThoughtWorks, our usually typical response is that you want to switch that to a more agile thing. So we stack up stages. So instead of having one after another, you do this kind of concurrent development. And that typically reduces the amount of non-value-added time, and especially the defects that come on at the end. Now, that's in general, obviously, because you have to do very specific techniques to get that. But I'm going through this just to show you that this approach, this value stream mapping, is a useful activity for us to do within our industry as well. It's not just useful tool within the manufacturing world or typical lean thing. So indicative numbers for this particular example was another ThoughtWorks consultant did this exercise. They moved from total elapsed time from 18 weeks to 18 weeks from 36 weeks, 900,000 from 1.8 million, cycle time efficiency improvement from 53% to 78%. So that's kind of an indicative thing. This is actually pretty good. We did, actually with that same guy, I went to a place in Melbourne and we did this exercise. I would say that what Paul was saying, we're at 20%, those kind of numbers efficiency, that's typical. I'd actually wonder whether or not they actually had 53%, whether they didn't expand enough of their value stream. But even within a software development process, our process efficiency numbers tend to be very low in the typical situation. Okay, I want to talk a bit about some things that are quite different than what you would see in lean manufacturing per se. You will notice this in lean product development, though. And I think it's useful for us to understand those specific tools because when you talk about lean, most people won't mention those things because it's not applicable. Set-based concurrent engineering, it's not really that complicated concept. I'm just make sure maybe this will clarify it. It's just the idea that when we design things, we typically have a lot of options to start with, and we don't feel comfortable with that kind of uncertainty, so we'll scrunch down to a point as fast as possible. So just that first diagram there, we kind of have all these decisions, and we pick one, and then we go. And now we're hoping and praying that we pick the right one because we have the least amount of information here. We made a decision. By the time we hit this, it's a bit too late. Either we wrap around, which is very expensive. This is what we call, this is rework waste for sure. Unnecessary iteration. And then it becomes or we just keep pushing forward with the wrong solution and just try to jam it into the space that we have. Set-based concurrent engineering is just the recognition that we need to essentially accommodate uncertainty as long as possible. Right? So there will be a particular point where we have to make a decision because if we work from the end, we have a target date. At some point, I have to make a decision because otherwise I'll run out of time. So I know at what point I need to make a decision, but I don't want to make a decision until that point. So this is the idea of the last responsible moment. So we work out what that moment is, and then we don't make a decision until we hit that point, which means we maximize our information. There's a military concept that relates to this. It's called horizon planning. So we don't, if I'm engaging in conflict here, there's a lot of unknowns. I don't want to make decisions until I have maximum information because otherwise I start making calls that risk the lives of the squad. So it's the same idea. We defer decisions, and therefore we maintain multiple options throughout the project. And then we start weeding them out over time. This is effectively, I would say, this is essentially the approach that Toyota took with the Prius, which led to that significant improvement in product development efficiency. So they maintained multiple versions of the hybrid engine, multiple versions of the shell, and then they just start weeding out as the time went on until eventually they ended up with the car. The other important part of this is that those variants, all these extra things, are not wasted. And if we think of this, product development is about learning efficiency. We are learning things about what doesn't work in this particular context, but we know that other contexts will show up. So an engine, for instance, that didn't work for the Prius will work for the Camry later on, in which case we don't have to relearn it. We just capture that information and we move on. Come just shift to something about mindset here. When I talk about waterfall and agile these days, I'm emphasized more about what happens from the perspective of problem awareness. So when we talk about the problem countermeasure board and things like that, what we are in essence saying is that we want to highlight and deal with issues right from the get-go. We don't want to hide them. I don't know how many people have been in projects where everything is green right to the last moment. Like every status report is, it's all good, it's all good, it's all good. And then at the end, oh, it's horrendous. And go, oh, well, I don't know. By that time, possibly the person who was running the project at that point has already left, so all they knew was as good. And then you deal with the mess at the end. So it's a very seductive approach because everyone wants to know good news. They want to hear good news. The lean approach is to say that we know that things aren't perfect. We know the problems exist. They're never, like no system's ever perfect. So therefore, we need to put in systems to encourage ourselves to acknowledge and recognize and even desire to hear all the bad stuff from the start so we can deal with it. From a leadership perspective, this is a shift in mindset from what John Shook, who is one of these lean gurus, first Toyota manager, Western Toyota manager in Japan, helped bring Toyota into North America. The idea of authority focus, which is thinking about job titles, whose job is this? Whose job is this? And it's not my problem. So if it's not part of my job description, then I don't need to worry about it. The hole is on your side of the boat, so it's okay. Versus responsibility focus. What's the right thing to do? How can I help? Right? If the hole's on your side of the boat, we're still going to drown, even though I'm bailing quite efficiently, but all the water's still leaking in, so we're still in trouble. That's the mindset shift. Most of us work on teams, even if they're large, and we know at the end of the day, our customer does not care that we can't coordinate. All they see is that we can't deliver. So irrespective of what our job titles are, we need to help each other out, and that's the shift in mindset. Run very quickly through some agile things that kind of fall underneath this. When we think about daily stand-ups, which we might do, we want to be thinking about in the same sense that a problem countermeasure board is used in Lean. It's an opportunity for us to raise issues that we must deal with rather than just a status thing. Same thing with these retrospectives, a very typical dysfunction. So actually, I ran quite quickly. How many people know what daily stand-ups are? Okay, that's good. Everyone. Excellent. We must have worked for these people at some point. And retrospectives, just this is similar to a post-mortem, except it's happening during the project, so you have a chance to correct. The important point is that you remember the objective. We have these things so that we can correct direction. If all we do is talk about things and we don't do anything about it, we've missed the point. All these things, that we highlight problems not to have a therapy session. It's not for us to feel good about sharing our pain, but it's more about having the opportunity to do something about it. Back in the beginning here, right? We're talking about survival thinking, being creative about dealing with the crisis that you're in, and surviving, being the ones that survive at the end. Okay, very quickly, other typical agile type techniques. If you think of from that frame, what we're talking about now is what kind of time frame do they detect issues for us to deal with? And therefore, if we don't do them, can we put something in place? Do we have other techniques that we can borrow from that also have similar properties that we can detect issues earlier and deal with them faster? The essence is still engaging people to solve problems. There's a paper which I quoted before when I was talking about the origin of Toyota. It was called Respect Science, Especially in a Crisis, which talks about the mindset of the line managers in early Toyota and how they survived the situation. There was no real plan. It was essentially being rigorous problem solvers and dealing with the fact that you have no cash, no money, and still need to produce high quality. And that requires rigor, discipline, following PDCA. Not just throwing stuff out there, but actually checking to see if they worked and start adjusting when they don't. And doing it very quickly. So what type of results are we talking about? Paul mentioned the healthcare results. There's a McKinsey article talking about applying lean concepts to software development, a 20 to 40% increase, which is sort of interesting. I kind of like this one better because I work for ThoughtWorks. So we have this Forrester research, Agile Lean, much large numbers. There are other factors involved here, but that's the kind of stuff we need to look at. Like if we're looking at surviving the situation, thriving in the situation, we need to look for some of the bigger type things and getting there using a lot of small improvements. It's important to note that we don't want to just look at this from the point of a single project. Single projects won't make that much difference. They disappear after a while. Like it produces a particular benefit, and after that, it's gone. What we're talking about really is a switch in how the organization functions. And that may start from a small seed, but lean is about organizational shift eventually. Right? It's not just what it took for Toyota to survive that situation, but what they became and what that took. From that perspective, there are actually quite a number of things to look at. whether or not people are focused on the customer. So whether they're thinking about the customer as opposed to shareholders, right? There's a phrase that people use, employees first, customers second, shareholders as a result. That's the kind of the order that they talk about, right? You need people to be thinking in a particular way to be able to satisfy customers. And by satisfying customers, inevitably, you'll produce a result for your shareholders. Leadership commitment, people engagement, various other things such as HR, activity monitoring, making sure that your hiring and training practices make sense, make sure that your incentives and the way you monitor projects or product lines make sense. All those things need to be involved. And there's even more details about this area of lean, especially when we bring in operations, leadership concepts, design and development. There's a lot of concepts out there. But in the end, we need to start where we are. So kind of have these simple steps. If you say what's next, we don't want to just say, okay, I'm going to go off and get my master's degree in lean concepts so then I'll be prepared. That takes too long. We're in where we are now, and we want to start where we are. So the main thing, start where you are. You don't want to shy away from your problems. This idea that no problem is a problem. Go and see, right? Find out what's actually happening. Don't have a theoretical view, but actually look closely. Think about it, right? If we think about PDCA, really what it is, it's the scientific method. We want to understand the situation, and we do learn, and we say that the best way to do that is to experiment, to look. Oh, out of tape. Okay, so now I'll give you the most important point. Sometimes you ask for help, and I don't mean this so we can kind of make a joke about, oh, I'm a consultant, so you should hire us. That's help. But the main thing is that it's hard to do this on your own. What Taiichi Ohno, the founder of TPS, realized at the beginning is that, and why engaging people became such an important principle, is because you realize that you can't do it yourself. There are too many problems out there, that the scale is too large. Unless you get more allies in the organization to start helping, we can't get to the scale necessary to survive crisis. We need more people, and that's the last and most important point. Okay, that's all. Thank you very much for attending. Something to say?
We do have some time for question and answers. Just a reminder, please fill out your evaluation forms, and if you are interested in a deeper dive, we've got this 2-day workshop coming up with the founders and authors of the books about lean software development and ThoughtWorks on the 16th and 17th of April. Questions or comments? Vigorous disagreements? Anybody want to start a fight? Back there?
Co-location, especially when you have a lot of teams spread all over the world.
What kind of work are you talking about?
Development work, new product, where the work has been dealing with the different teams, like the one in US, one in India, and one in Australia.
Okay, let me think about this. One is that if you look at lean product development, when they talk about that, so just stepping outside software for a moment, that happens, right? So you have multiple suppliers, and that happens. You have this kind of global situation. Now, what Paul was mentioning, it is easier when you're closer, right? Because we're reducing transportation costs in a physical sense, but also there are time zone issues, handoffs, that sort of stuff. We know that happens. So if you can get away from that, better. Short term, that's not going to happen, right? You may not be able to move everyone, so you have to deal with the situation you're in. Really, when I deal with that, you have to acknowledge that you aren't sitting beside each other, which means that you have to be a little bit more rigorous about your interfacing. So in terms of agreeing upon how you're going to communicate, agreeing upon things that will change at a slower rate, and then actually sending people around to try to deal with that as well, like to seed some understanding across teams.
I think the other thing is that, lean is all about visualization. It's trying to sort of visualize the process that you're going through. And I think you can do that quite easily, even though you might be sending it electronically to your colleagues around the world. I think, preferably, you'd want them in the same room and looking at the same piece of paper so you can discuss it. But I think visualization of the process that you're going through, the plan that you've got, where you are on the plan, whether you've got any blowouts, whether you're ahead of schedule. I think the visualization process within Lean is quite a powerful tool, and you can use that whether you've got someone stood by the side of you or whether you've got someone in America. Certainly it works within the organizations that I've worked for, including sort of big American companies who have got divisions all over the place, and we're regularly telephone conferencing and looking at the same piece of paper, the same plan, so that we all know what's going on.
I would add that in software development, half of our global workforce is in India and China, and there are software tools and techniques that we use in addition to high bandwidth communications, moving people around, having project members visit each other. Things like test-driven development, continuous integration, working off the same code base and committing many builds a day that the teams can do regardless of where they are in the world, that ensures high-quality outputs that many other offshore providers don't do.
I think the other thing is sort of sharing resources as well, making sure that you have got, if you've got sort of 10 people around the world, that they're all working on different things, and that you're sharing the workload. And if you go back to the original screen that we were talking about, overburdening, I think if you consider that when you've got a number of people all around the world looking at, solving a particular problem, if you can share that workload across that skill base, and that's also something that's quite useful.
This kind of reminds me of standard work, actually, because I'm just thinking about, I think it was either Boeing or Airbus. One of them was, they're talking about the CAD software they were using. I don't know if you heard about this one.
Nope.
So they're talking about the CAD software they were using. So standard work is just the idea that we're consistent in how we approach things, so therefore we reduce the amount of variation we need to deal with. So if we have a lot of differences, that causes greater probability of mistakes happening just because we're doing things differently. Now, if we standardize to some extent, we can control that variation. Now, with software development, it's slightly different because we actually want some variation from an innovation point of view, but some stuff, it doesn't matter. So, for example, how do we manage the project or report progress, that sort of thing? If we have consistency there, we know that we won't misunderstand the particular technique we're using, right? So I report something, I know you're reporting it the same way, and so I don't go, oh, when he said almost done, that actually meant 50%, but these guys mean 90%, that's not good, right? Because we have to be very aware of that because we know we don't have the direct nonverbal stuff to deal with that, so we have to be a lot more strict about those communication mechanisms. I mentioned the Boeing thing because they had that issue where they standardized their CAD software to make sure that when they designed something and they pulled a blueprint out, it was actually the same thing, because they knew that in the past they didn't do that, and I put a design that was not even close to what you were doing, and none of the parts actually fit together anymore, which is quite expensive when you have large multi-million-dollar planes.
And how often does that happen in your software organization?
Oh, lots. Right? It's integration
Just
hell.
probably add one more comment. I agree with all of the comments in the front, but the other system that works really well, one of the lean principles, is pull system. So I think a concept called look-ahead planning, when you're developing across multi-countries, if you've got a rigorous system of looking ahead, what do I need to do this week, how's that communicated, reviewing against your visual plans, you can start to pull the work through to the different countries that has to be done. And the further your horizon out, the more uncertainty, but generally 4 to 6 weeks look ahead, dealt with on a weekly basis and confirming, allows you to work very collaboratively across a distributed network. So I agree with everything of that, but we'd also add that concept as well.
That's good. Was it Andrew from KM&T?
That's my colleague, Alan.
Just seated the crowd. I just want to add to that because a Kanban, so the idea of having that visual signal to pull work, like if you look at how a real Toyota plant works, you have these things that that's how they're distributing across suppliers. You have this card, which is saying, do this much because I need that much. And if it turns out that these guys don't need that much, you don't get the card, you just don't produce that stuff. So that's how you do it. But there are, I would say that the larger the distribution, the more forecasting you require just to deal with that and buffering, etc. Which is why if you can keep them closer, you don't have to spend as much on that.
We have time for probably one final question before we promise to get you out of here.
Thanks. Jason, I had a question for you. We spoke a lot about new product development. What about when it comes to implementing vendor products? Does Lean work equally
Implementing
well? Vendor products? You bought it in the
modifying customized software.
Yeah, so your comments on would Lean work equally well for those sort of projects or probably not?
No, I'm just thinking about that. So what's the nature of customizing a vendor product? I think we have a similar situation where we don't necessarily understand the solution very well, right? So you can probably take similar tactics. At some point you will, in which case it can become a little bit more controlled. Now, I think the way I would think about it is, how well do I understand what I'm building this for, and how well do I understand the limitations of this thing I'm modifying? A custom product is just like a new technology, really. Or not a custom, sorry, a vendor product is just like a new technology. And we don't necessarily start out knowing a lot about it, so we have to spend a lot of time learning it, and we accommodate probably our project plan for that. As we gain more knowledge, and because it is somewhat stable, then we can shift to a different type of mode. That's how I would sort of see that.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks for coming, everyone.